listener production.
Hey, Chris Spyrou with you. Welcome to The Briefing. In a surprise to absolutely no one, this year's election is being fought hard on, yep, you guessed it, cost of living. And with the latest polling suggesting Anthony Albanese won't be in for a second term, it was only a matter of time before he rolled out something big. And where did he land? Free healthcare. Over the weekend, the Prime Minister announced if elected, Labor would inject $8.5 billion into Medicare over the next 4 years.
One card guarantees it all. One card covers it all. Not your credit card, this, your Medicare card.
That was Albo at a campaign-style rally in Launceston on Sunday, unveiling what his government claims will be the single largest investment in Medicare since its creation more than 4 decades ago. The aim, aside from winning over financially stretched voters, is to address the massive drop in rates of bulk billing around the country, pledging to make 90% of GP visits free by the end of the decade. And of course, the announcement didn't come without some feisty jabs from the PM.
In 10 years, the Liberals turned bulk billing from a service you could count on to something that you have to search for. And that wasn't an accident born of their neglect or their incompetence. It was their goal all along.
But that same afternoon, Opposition Leader Peter Dutton announced he was matching Labor's promise, dollar for dollar. Eager to avoid another effective Medi-Scare campaign keeping them out of power, Shadow Health Minister Anne Ruston had this to say on Sunday.
They are prepared to use this as a scare campaign. The Labor Party are making an announcement to fix a problem that they have caused, so we will support them fixing the mess.
So if you haven't caught on already, there's of course a whole heap of finger-pointing about whose fault it is that we've been paying more to see the doctor. But who exactly should we believe? And whoever wins office, will we actually see free GP visits again? James Gillespie is the CEO of Cleanbill, an online directory of all the GPs in Australia who bulk bill and those that don't. James, welcome back to The Briefing. This is a huge promise and commitment from Labor. In real terms, how many people will benefit from this $8.5 billion commitment?
So you're absolutely right. It is a massive commitment that we've seen over the weekend. $8.5 billion over the next 4 years to extend the bulk billing incentive out to cover all Australians. And that's the key thing when we're looking at the number of Australians who will benefit from this. So unlike the bulk billing incentive changes that we saw at the end of 2023, they were announced at the start of 2023, those bulk billing incentive changes tripled the bulk billing incentive, but it was at a time where the bulk billing incentive only covered concession patients. Now, that is still the case, but what this policy looks at is expanding that coverage out to cover all Australians, so regular adults as well. And that means that you're not only going to have the 60% of appointments that are covered by concession patients receiving this bulk billing incentive, but every single time any Australian goes into the GP, it will attract this additional incentive payment if the GP chooses to bulk bill those patients. So there's potentially a far larger group of patients who will benefit from this than who benefited initially from the bulk billing incentive changes in 2023.
You've touched on something there, that this is essentially an incentive that GPs have to opt into. Given that that's the case and it's not a blanket guarantee, how likely then do you think it is that we will see 9 in 10 Aussies by 2030 having their GP visits bulk billed?
So the 9 in 10 number is obviously a prediction. It's impossible to know how many GP clinics will actually put this into play. It's worth noting with the bulk billing incentive that what it's really putting onto individual GP clinics is a choice. GP clinics can continue to charge their out-of-pocket costs over and above the Medicare rebate to their regular adult patients, but the GP clinic won't be able to collect the bulk billing incentive for those patients. So the clinic's really choosing between continuing to charge its out-of-pocket costs and collecting this bulk billing incentive instead. Now, the bulk billing incentive scales based on how far away you are from a metropolitan area. So in very regional areas, it's a lot higher than it is in, say, the middle of Sydney, for example. But what you're really looking at to see whether or not clinics bring this up, start using it, and whether or not 9 in 10 people actually get access to it is the number of clinics across the country for which the out-of-pocket costs they charge are already fairly similar to what the bulk billing incentive would be. And so it makes economic sense for them to stop charging an out-of-pocket cost and switch to taking on the additional bulk billing incentive payment as well. And what we've seen is that in the majority of electorates across the country, the average out-of-pocket costs that GP clinics are charging are still higher than what that bulk billing incentive would be. Now, those are just averages. There are clinics that charge on both sides of them, and it's foreseeable that a clinic that's less expensive in a given area will switch from charging their patients an out-of-pocket cost to just receiving the bulk billing incentive from the government. But it's really difficult to know at this stage how many clinics will make that change and whether or not that will flow through to patients at the levels that we've seen.
Why would a clinic choose not to bulk bill? In your opinion, is that something that entirely hinges on making more money out of everyday Australians?
This is a decision that's being made by individual clinics up and down the country all the time. And it really comes to the way that clinics operate in their community. I think there are a lot of clinics out there that are making a fairly raw economic decision, deciding, okay, well, it costs this much for me to keep my practice open, for me to see my patients, for me to pay all of the utilities bills, pay for my receptionist, pay for the rent associated with running my practice. And so I have to charge an out-of-pocket cost, and this is how much the out-of-pocket cost has to be. We've also seen the rise of large practice groups, which own multiple locations. And for them, not always, but often the economic incentive has to be higher because they have administrative staff on top of it as well. But we also do see a lot of GPs operating in their community who, whilst they might not bulk bill patients who they don't know who are coming in for the first time, once they build that individual relationship with the patient and can understand that patient's economic circumstances, they may in fact switch to bulk billing that patient in order to ensure that they can get the care that they need. So it's a little bit difficult to know because individual clinics are making small decisions like this all the time, and all of that impacts access to care.
I do want to return to the policy and kind of, let's go down a bit of a history route here and take a trip down memory lane. Medicare was designed as a universal scheme, meaning it would benefit every single Australian. When did bulk billing stop living up to that promise?
So what Cleanbill has data on is from the start of 2023 to the start of 2025. That's a fairly narrow window in the scheme of Medicare and in the scheme of bulk billing. And we've seen in just that period of time, the percentage of clinics that will bulk bill a non-concession adult patient has fallen from 35.1% to 20.7%. So we've seen a fairly considerable decline in just the last 2 years. But that decline, in order to get to 35.1%, has obviously been happening for some period of time prior to that. In the last 2 years, I think there's a lot to be said of the economic circumstances that we've all faced. I mean, it would be very difficult to find anyone who would say that the last 2 years have been easy economically. The cost of living pressures have been enormous. And it's worth remembering that a lot of GP clinics are still small businesses and are having to take into account those inflationary and cost of living pressures too. But there's also something to be said for the different policies that have been adopted over periods of time in the lead up to 2023 that have gotten us to a point where we're at a 35.1% bulk billing rate to start off with, and where that's seen as comparably high when you're looking at the data from the start of this year.
So when Albo rolled out this announcement on the weekend, he pretty much said that destroying bulk billing was an objective of the coalition and something that tracks back a decade. How true is that?
So a lot of this conjecture is based on the notion that whilst Peter Dutton was health minister under the Abbott government, we saw this freeze of Medicare rebates. So between 2013 and 2018, Medicare rebates, which are the base payment that GPs receive when they see you, it's a bit different to the bulk billing incentive. They receive this no matter what. They receive it regardless of whether or not they charge you an out-of-pocket cost. That was frozen, so it didn't increase. As inflation takes its effect, it meant that as the costs of running a clinic went up, the amount that GPs were receiving from the government for seeing patients didn't go up with it. It's supposed to. So the fact that it was frozen for 5 years means that GPs had to continually eat the additional costs that they were receiving without getting additional support from the government. And a large part of that comes from the fact these Medicare rebates were frozen during Peter Dutton's time as health minister. They were frozen under Tony Abbott and under Malcolm Turnbull. But it's worth remembering that Peter Dutton and Tony Abbott, they didn't start the freeze. So the freeze was started by Julia Gillard in the 2013-2014 budget. Now, it's notable that the freeze was only originally supposed to be for a year, but the freeze didn't initially start with the coalition. The coalition just continued it on from there. And I think it's a fairly fair position to take that the freeze that we had seen in the past is at least somewhat responsible for the differences in bulk billing that we see today.
Which actually brings us to today, where we have, these reports of young Australians and a lot of young families actively choosing not to visit the GP because of that out-of-pocket expense. What data do you have in that field that can kind of paint us a bit of a picture of what that looks like?
Yeah, this is a really unfortunate trend that we've been seeing. So Cleanbill doesn't collect data on this, but luckily the Australian Bureau of Statistics does, so we can see what the impact on the community has been. And in 2021-22, the Australian Bureau of Statistics recorded that about 600,000 Australian adults hadn't gone to see the GP in the previous year because of concerns surrounding costs. Now, that's quite a high number, but I would say only there because in the 2 years since then, that number has ballooned to over 1.5 million Australians per year not going to see the GP because of concerns surrounding costs. That's almost tripled in just the last 2 years. And so that's absolutely the effects that you see of lower bulk billing rates, higher out-of-pocket costs, and a broader cost of living scenario that makes it very difficult for people to afford those higher costs when they have to afford higher costs for everything else too.
Are you personally aware of any examples of how this has played out to tragic circumstances, or in circumstances that are more than just, someone having a cold for a prolonged amount of time and it's really led to something a bit more dire?
So I'm fortunately not personally aware of any individual circumstances leading to this. I'm sure a lot of your listeners would unfortunately be in a position where they are aware of personal circumstances like that. It's natural to assume that if you have that many Australians not going to see a GP because of cost, they're either then not going to see anyone at all and either suffering through an issue that they may have or allowing that issue to continue to get worse until a point where they need to go to hospital no matter what. And I think that's the flow-on effect of the data that we're seeing here. When bulk billing rates go down, when out-of-pocket costs go up, when you have economic circumstances that stretch people in all areas and healthcare becomes a cost that they cannot afford, then they're going to end up either going to the hospital in the first place because they know that's a place that they're going to be able to get care and that it will be free, or putting it off to the point that there are either tragic circumstances or they go to a hospital with a far more acute condition that could have been dealt with earlier had they been able to see a GP in the community.
I want to talk about impact for just a second longer. We know that the way that bulk billing works at the moment is that there's a bit of disparity in who it benefits. We know that in lower socioeconomic areas that they have higher rates of bulk billing practices and they can get it cheaper. So where I'm from in Southwest Sydney, I think it's like an 80 to 85% of medical practices you can get bulk billing. But then we also have areas like Tasmania where the rates are far lower. Why are we seeing that disparity?
Well, I mean, you're very lucky, Chris. So Western Sydney is just about Western Sydney is just about the only jurisdiction in the country where you're seeing these really high bulk billing rates hold on for regular adults. And in fact, in our Blue report at the start of this year, we weren't able to find a single GP clinic across Tasmania that was both available, so taking on new patients, and would bulk bill a regular adult patient for a standard consultation. So that's unbelievable. That means that there's just no bulk billing available in the entire state, and it becomes a situation of, okay, how can I afford the out-of-pocket costs here? And I think costs are an element that you need to look into for that. Whilst it would be expensive, undoubtedly, to run a clinic in Sydney, the costs can be a lot higher in places like Tasmania and particularly regional Tasmania, because you're looking to get resources out there, you need to get labour out there. The rent may in fact be lower, but the cost of getting the resources out there to run that practice and continue that practice is a lot more difficult. We've also seen a trend away in the last couple of years from GPs going and working remotely and working in regional areas. And so it can be difficult to get the talent out there to start off with. And often when GPs are retiring out there, they aren't being replaced. And so that also, in a lot of cases, creates demand for these GP services that in some cases they're just not able to meet. So you do see those accessibility issues, particularly in a lot of regional areas. And Tasmania is unfortunately the most clear example of that, but it's happening up and down the country.
Well, it sounds like it was no coincidence that Albo decided to launch this policy in Tasmania. Do you think these reforms will be able to ease those pressures?
It's a bit difficult to know what it will ultimately result in. I'd be keen for Cleanbill to conduct an analysis to see the number of clinics we're likely to see passing on these changes and taking on the bulk billing incentive instead of charging an out-of-pocket cost. But until the rubber hits the road and until we see which clinics are making those changes, it's really difficult to know. It could be a really, really large change to the number of Australians who are able to access bulk billing care. But it's also worth remembering that when this happens, there are going to be huge changes to billing arrangements for clinics up and down the country. Thousands of clinics across the country will have to reconsider their billing practices. And it's going to be critically important that there are directories out there like Cleanbill that people can use to find those affordable and available GPs around them when these price changes are taking effect.
In his announcement, Anthony Albanese described this election as a make or break moment for Medicare. How true do you think that is, given now that the coalition has matched their policy?
Well, the coalition matching the policy was really great to see because it means that no matter who you vote for in this election, no matter who ultimately wins, it seems almost certain that we'll get this policy coming through on the 1st of November this year, which is just great for Australians and particularly the Australians who will benefit from this policy being rolled out in their local clinic. I mean, it's difficult to know what the ultimate effect of this is going to be on the election, as you said, because it's been matched. To me, it's a really, really hopeful sign, though, that there is recognition in our decision makers. They've looked at the data and they've been able to see, okay, there are real problems here, particularly for non-concession patients. There are real problems here. And so they're going to be in a position to bring out this policy that in some ways may help to solve that issue. And so that's really just generally great to see.
Well, James, thank you once again for joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you, Chris.
That was James Gillespie, CEO of Cleanbill, talking with me there. That is it for this episode of The Briefing. We'd love it if you could share this episode with someone who you think might enjoy it. Maybe someone who's a little bit undecided heading into this federal election and looking to cut through all the political spin and figure out what is actually going on with what is being promised. And hey, if you want to keep up with our other content, you absolutely can, and we welcome and encourage that. Check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. And don't forget, we'll be back in your feed tomorrow with a brand new episode at 6 a.m. Until then, I'm Chris Spyrou. Catch you next time.